Guess that means you'll have to come back." Adam asked Zach a series of questions about what he'd been up to over the last few years. He was as congenial as his sister, but they didn't get to talk long before he excused himself to grab a hot cocoa refill for his wife and himself. "So, you came to see the tree lighting. That's a surprise." Her tone let him know he hadn't imagined the look of hurt in her eyes when yesterday came up. He'd been insensitive and thoughtless. He wasn't going to make the same mistake today. "I figured you'd be here," he said. "I know how much you like these things, and I wanted to give you a little gift to say thanks for all of your help." "Oh, Zach, that's sweet. Totally unnecessary, but sweet." He handed her the bag, and her face lit up when she pulled out the ornament. "Oh my gosh, Zach, how did you know about the lighthouse?" He finished for her, taking a page out of her book. "Lucky guess, but I'm glad you like it." Tears glistened in her eyes. "More than you could imagine. This is the East Channel Lighthouse. Grandpa Shelton always used to take us there for summer picnics. He used to paint it." She flipped the ornament gently, and her breath hitched. There, etched in calligraphy, was the signature, Shelton. "This is one of his. He used to make them and sell them at local fairs. Where did you find it?" "Over there." He pointed toward the woman who'd set her table up right near the window, but now the space was empty. "That's strange. She's gone." She gripped his hand, igniting that familiar spark through his coat. "My grandpa died before I could really get to know him." She held up the ornament. "And you just brought back a little piece of him." He arched his brows and shook his head. Yeah, I wish I could take credit. It's quite a cool coincidence." The buzz of the crowd seemed to quiet. Or maybe it wasn't. I'd like to think of it as a Christmas miracle. Quiet turned to song, and the tree's lights flickered on. He wasn't ready to call this a miracle, but he knew one thing for sure. This Christmas was one he'd remember for the rest of his life. Chapter 13. Things Change. Linda. Linda turned on the Christmas tree's lights and studied the reception area of Zach's office in the soft white glow. Outside, glacial lake winds had been whipping snow into deep drifts all night long and showed no signs of relenting this morning. The windows had frosted, lacy flakes stenciled the edges of each pane, but none of the coldness reached inside these walls. After just a few weeks of work, things had finally come together in a cozy, cheerful, orderly way. A state she loved, but one that was hard to accomplish with 11 siblings running in and out of her life. Currently living in the carriage house with her 2 sisters wasn't as chaotic as childhood had been, and having them around all the time was great, but there was something deeply attractive about the sense of peace that filled her in Zach's presence. She was going to miss coming here every day. Her gaze fell to the folder of notes she'd made for Cheryl Russell. Now that Linda had a filing system in place, all Cheryl had to do was maintain it. And Linda had spent the past 2 days showing her how to do just that. The younger woman was turning out to be a great find. She'd moved away to study dental hygiene but was back home after a bad breakup. A bit on the quiet side, but she was a hard worker. People from the island knew her. They liked her too, liked coming in and seeing another familiar face. Linda's heart ached. Once the last 2 puppies found a home, there would be no more need for her to come in other than social visits. "Good morning," Zach said. She jumped a little. She hadn't heard him come down the stairs. In a thick cable-knit sweater that accentuated his broad chest, he added to the room's feeling of coziness. "Is this for me?" He used his chin to gesture to the fresh blueberry muffin. "I think you know the answer to that." She smiled. She'd been bringing him muffins regularly. His warm brown eyes smiled down at her as he handed her a steaming mug of coffee, then sat in the waiting room chair beside her. He'd been bringing her coffee every morning. Their cozy breakfasts were another thing she would miss when she left. She took a sip. The rich caramel flavor tasted like heaven and added to her coziness. "Thank you. Your coffee game has come a long way in the last few weeks." He'd even added oat milk for her. her favorite. "Things change when you're brewing for two. I could tell from that first cup you weren't a big fan of instant," he said. "Now, who's the perceptive one?" She elbowed him in the bicep gently. "What can I say? You're a good influence." His gaze dropped, but he didn't blush. He seemed more comfortable expressing his emotions now, too. Training Cheryl had required Linda to spend more time around Zach than she'd originally anticipated. Helping her and Leanne brought something good out of him. He seemed more relaxed, happier. "Okay, question," she said. "Okay, answer, maybe." She smiled. "Did you ever figure out why it was so important for you that Leanne has a puppy?" She leaned back in her chair, cradling her mug to her chest. He took a sip of his coffee and stared out at the lake on the other side of the snowy window. The edges of his lips dipped, and he squinted like he was trying to find the answer in the distant waters. "I don't know," he finally said. "Honestly, maybe because I didn't have one as a kid. In a weird way, I don't think I would have had some of the emotional gaps that I have if I'd grown up with pets. Being around these guys has shown me pure joy and goodness and trust. There's so much trust there." He sipped his coffee again. "I saw another only child, and I just wanted her to have a better foundation than I had." His answer took her breath away. He used money from his own savings so a child he didn't know wouldn't grow up with the same wound he carried. This man had so much more depth and compassion than she'd originally given him credit for. His caring heart was beautiful. "Wow, just wow," she said, emotions heating her cheeks. She'd wanted to kiss him before, but now... The mini-explosion in her heart made it hard to stay seated. "Wow. You're a good guy, Zachary Albert." "You doubted me?" he said, setting his coffee aside. "Don't answer that." He didn't need to worry about her saying a thing, because the look that came over his eyes temporarily robbed her of the ability to speak. Zach Albert was staring at her like she was the answer to his heart's every desire. With him sitting in the chair beside her, as he had every morning for the last several weeks, she could not only hear the breath gliding over his lips, but she felt it as if it were giving her new life, until he edged so close that the heat from his skin blazed against her own, creating a stir deep within. 1 second, time stood still. The next second, it hurtled forward. His lips pressed against hers, and the world spun so fast she could barely tell up from down. Her lips parted on a sigh, and he deepened the kiss with his tongue. Firm and soft at the same time, Zach Albert tasted like caramel, coffee, and beneath those flavors was a truth she'd been keeping at bay since she'd first seen him again at the cafe. This man ignited something within her that she hadn't even known existed until now. The main door swung open, and they pulled apart like startled rabbits. Nick, the mailman, stepped inside. He looked around and then retreated outside. Zach's brows formed a question mark, and she laughed. Nick re-entered, scratching his wool cap. "Had to check and make sure I was in the right spot. Love what you've done with the place. Been coming here since before I can remember, and I'm sure I've never seen it look so..." "Charming, cheerful, adorable," Linda offered, her heart still racing. She was somewhat surprised at her quick recovery from the most memorable kiss of her life. Never before had she been more grateful for her nervous tendency to chit-chat. She hoped it would mask the charged atmosphere and keep Nick from realizing what he'd interrupted. The last thing she wanted was for the town to hear about this before she'd had a minute to make sense of what had just happened. "All of the above," Nick said, "and I don't remember ever seeing a Christmas tree here." Zach smiled, the warmth in his eyes kindling her own. "Guess that's what happens when a Christensen enters the picture." Linda's shoulders straightened. His acknowledgement, layered on top of that electrifying kiss, had her yearning for another. Although she normally savored her conversation with the same gusto as she would a good meal, this morning she found herself contemplating a swift exit just to steal another moment alone with Zach. "The pictures on the wall are you too, Linda." Nick stood before an old black and white of the lighthouse during the winter. "Yes." She couldn't help but beam with a little pride. Pictures of local landmarks hung on all the walls. Zach had spent 2 days praising her for coming up with the idea and reacted like she'd invented sliced bread when she told him she had enough pictures to do seasonally themed displays. "You know how it is," she said. "The family attics are full of treasures." "Sure are," Nick said, running his bare paw hand over his grizzly beard. "You've got some nice ones here. Looks like some of these date back decades." "They do." Linda pointed to the picture of the lighthouse. "My great-grandfather took that when the lighthouse was built in 1895. "Wow, that ought to be in a museum. These are really something special." "I'm happy it's here, in a place where people who need help and healing will find it. Somehow, I think the picture reminds people of hope, and that both the lighthouse and the picture itself have endured so long is a testament to strength." She hadn't meant to say so much, but as usual, the words had just come rushing out. Nick whistled. "You got a keeper here, Doc. You know that, right?" Zach coughed, clearly embarrassed by the inference that they were together. "What brings you in today?" he asked. I almost forgot. Got a drop-off for you." Nick patted the blue satchel. "Since when do you guys do drop-offs?" she asked. Usually everyone went to the post office to pick up their mail and left with the latest gossip. "Dr. Albert Sr. called and asked that we make an exception," Nick said. "So what you got here is what we call a special delivery." Out of the corner of her eye, Linda saw Zach's shoulders stiffen. Mention of the elder Albert almost always elicited a frown. She wished there was something she could do. Donner came tumbling over, interrupting the moment. "Now, who is this sweet dog?" Nick asked. "That's Donner. She's the bashful one of the group. She normally hides whenever the door opens. She must like you," Zach said. He was right. He'd come so far. For the first few days, he'd refused to call them anything other than that one or this one. "I heard you guys found some puppies. No one seems to know where they came from, huh?" Annette, Linda and Zach looked at each other and shook their heads. "She seems like a sweet girl," Nick said. Donner put her paws on his shin and wagged her tail, as if she agreed. He put down his mailbag and picked her up. "I sure do miss old Mac. Best ice fishing buddy a guy could ask for. Losing him was a special kind of hurt. I don't know if I'll ever be able to find a bond like that again." Donner nudged her snout against his chin, then stared up at his face. Her look was almost a challenge. Linda knew what he was going to say next. "Never will if you aren't open to it," all three of them said at the same time. Zach's and Nick's jaws both dropped. "Jinx, I feel like I should slug something. What is it when 3 people say the same thing at the same time?" Nick asked. "The truth," Linda said. Zach smiled and Nick nodded. "Think you might be onto something there, Ms. Christensen. I know everyone at the post office missed having a dog to pal around with. I mean, has anyone expressed an interest?" Nick asked. Linda shook her head. She sure is a cute little girl." Donner wagged her tail. "I think she understands." Nick flashed them a grin, then looked back down at the pup. "Aw, heck, what do you say, Donner? Do you want to come back to the post office with me? Sort some mail, stamp some Christmas cards, and then do a little ice fishing?" Donner yipped and wagged her tail some more. Nick rubbed his index finger behind her ear. There was no mistaking her happiness when she covered the man's ruddy cheek with her tongue. Nick laughed. "I'll take that as a yes." "Yeah?" Linda moved closer and scratched Donner's head. "You sure, Nick?" Everyone on the island had seen some of the light in Nick's eyes dim when his Mac had passed away. He and that dog had been inseparable. She thought she might even have a few pictures of them out on the ice. He tucked his thumb under the dog's chin, and she nuzzled her nose closer to him. "Ready or not, this girl's coming with me. If it's okay with you two, that is." "It's perfect. We've been hoping she'd find a good home before Christmas, and I can't think of a better match," Linda said. "I've got a little jacket and blanket you can wrap her in." "Oh, here," Nick said, reaching down into his satchel and handing Zach the box. "I almost forgot. Looks like your father might have sent you a Christmas present." Zach took the box from Nick like it might be radioactive. I doubt it. Pain flickered in Zach's eyes, disappearing as quickly as it had come. Nick didn't seem to notice. He was too enamored with his new buddy, but Linda saw it plain as day. She tried to make eye contact, to send him reassuring energy, but he didn't glance in her direction. Did he know what was inside the box? Was that what upset him? Or was it the simple reminder of his father? "Well, folks, been a pleasure chatting, but we have to get going now," Nick said, picking up his satchel. "I'm sure I'll see you beforehand, but Merry Christmas, just in case I don't." They said their goodbyes, and once Linda was sure Nick was gone, she turned to Zach. He'd seemed so upset about the box. She wanted to cheer him up. Her toes and fingers were tingling with excitement, and she debated sharing her thoughts. Regardless of what the box contained, Nick's visit was good for the office. He'd carry word of the pictures to the town, and curiosity would bring more folks in, maybe bring back up those numbers Zach had been so focused on. Wow. Since when was she on board with Zach's commercial goals? Of course, she'd always wanted him to succeed. She just hadn't wanted him to cheapen Christmas by making it a means to that end, or to see him not put his heart into caring for the puppies. "I think Nick and Donner will be really good for each other," she said at last. "I think so, too." His smile and the corner of his eyes crinkled, a telltale sign he was happy. It's actually been fun finding homes for them and seeing the joy they bring to people. His words brushed her heart like a warm summer breeze. "Sounds like someone's catching the Christmas spirit," she said. He chuckled. "It's hard not to in this town. And I take it from that smile you've decided that's not such a bad thing." "I like it. Thank you for opening my eyes." Like when she'd given him the scarf, his gratitude radiated bright as the sun. "Are you planning to spend Christmas with your family?" she asked. His smile crumpled. Darn, she was so good at reading people. Why hadn't she phrased that question differently or gone straight to her point? "No," he answered. "The whole reason my dad retired was so he and his new wife could spend winters in Florida. We'd love to have you at our place. My mom started making rum cake on Halloween using Gloria St. James' recipe from St. Croix. It's otherworldly. You'll love it?" That'd be nice, but I'm not sure if I can." "Why not? You know everyone, and you haven't been by for a proper dinner since you got back to the island." He sipped his coffee, but Linda had a sense he did it just to stall. "Cheryl and Leanne already invited me," he finally said. "Oh, wow." That was a blow she hadn't seen coming at all. Why had he kissed her if he and Cheryl were a thing? Inwardly, she scoffed. Clearly, the kiss meant more to her than him. Disappointment tugged at the corners of her lips and the center of heart, but she fought it. "I see." And she really did. Cheryl was even younger than he was. She was pretty and sweet. Plus, they both worked in medical professions, so they had a lot in common. They made sense. Even if they didn't, it wasn't any of her business. "Well, that'll be really nice," she said, taking a page out of his book and sipping her own coffee. It gave her something to do other than look at him. He was getting more perceptive, and she didn't want him to have an inkling of how his news had blasted through her heart, the fact of which completely rattled her. It wasn't until his disclosure that she'd realized just how much she wanted to spend Christmas with him, and she finally had to admit the truth to herself. Somewhere between tree decorating, puppy feeding, office organizing, and tending to patients, she'd started to fall for the young doctor. But that kiss, it had pushed her right over the edge. Without another word, she set down her coffee and picked up her coat. Linda Christensen wasn't a woman given to dramatics, but her mind was reeling, and she couldn't breathe in the office anymore. "I'll be back." Except when the door closed behind her, she thought she might not be telling the truth. Chapter 14, Candy Cane Cocoa. Linda. On the way back to the farm, Linda stopped at Cafe Joy. She loved the holiday atmosphere Nova had cultivated, and her holiday cocoa was a perfect cure for the blues she hadn't been able to shake since learning Zach would be spending Christmas with Cheryl. Nova handed Linda her drink, a concerned expression wrinkling her brow. "Are you okay today?" "Why do you ask? Was her heartache that obvious?" For starters, you never order a pumpkin spice latte. I don't know how many times you've told me that's a Thanksgiving drink, not Christmas." Linda groaned inwardly. How did people put up with her? Cheryl probably didn't have an entire list of musts in order to celebrate the holiday. "And you let me give you whipped cream," Nova added. "Ah!" This time, Linda actually groaned aloud. Nova raced around the corner to drag her to the nearest table. "Okay, spill it," Nova said, sitting across from Linda. "I can't have you moaning over my drinks. Someone's going to get the wrong idea." Linda laughed and fingered the berries on the evergreen centerpiece. "I just compared myself to another woman, something I promised myself I would never do." "Oh, how the mighty have fallen." Nova smacked her palm to her forehead theatrically. "Just kidding, but seriously, cut yourself some slack. We all do that every once in a while. What brought it out in you?" "Not a what, a who." Nova leaned across the table. "Zach Albert?" Linda nodded, then let her head fall into her hands. "I don't know how it happened. One minute I was sure he was too young for me. The next, I'm crying into my pumpkin spice latte because he's going to have Christmas dinner with Cheryl Russell." "Hold the cliches. Your eyes look pretty dry to me. And just because they're having Christmas together doesn't mean he's interested in her. You should have seen the way he gaped at you that first day. Even before you guys started talking, he couldn't keep his eyes off you." "What are you talking about?" "Trust me. I can see everything that happens in this little cafe from that counter." She pointed to the space next to her pastry display fridge. "Everything. I hear things too." Linda leaned back in her chair. "What's that supposed to mean?" "You know how this town is. Everyone's talking about how the doctor has a thing for you. Do you honestly think a man would let a woman redecorate his home if he wasn't interested in her?" "It wasn't his home. It was his office. And come to think of it, I haven't even seen the inside of his personal space upstairs. Since when is being a gentleman a bad thing? Maybe he's just waiting until you guys aren't working together to ask you out because he doesn't want to make things awkward. Except he is going out with Cheryl." "Oh, then it can't be a date, right?" Nova blew a non-existent strand of hair off her forehead. "I mean, maybe he was just too nice to tell her no when she invited him." "I don't know about that." "Well, I'm not wrong about what other folks are seeing and saying," Nova insisted. "Since when does that make it true?" Linda tapped her mug. "I guess you won't know until you speak to him, and honestly, I can't believe you even have to ask. You're usually a real-life fortune-telling Mistress Cleo when it comes to knowing what people are thinking." "I thought I did, but people change their minds." Linda took a sip of her pumpkin spice latte. This is good." Nova smiled, but as soon as the words were out of Linda's mouth, she cringed. Yes, people did change their minds. And maybe Zach had changed his mind about her. It was entirely possible. And maybe this morning had been more her than him. Well, there was only one way to find out. Chapter 15. Donner. Zach. Zach stared at the wooden box on his kitchen table. The card that had come with it lay in a crumpled ball in the trash. Even there, it was too close. He grabbed a plastic bag from beneath the sink and swept the box, containing cigars, into the bag, then dumped the kitchen trash on top, tied it, and carried it outside to the garbage bin. But he couldn't throw away his father's words. The contents of the note his father had written kept coming back to him. "I hear Linda Christensen is the new receptionist. Good job finding a nice-looking local to bring all the yokels in. You may be a chip off the old block after all." Zach grunted. The first Christmas present his father had sent him in years came because he thought Zach was using a woman to advance the family business. And truthfully, he had done some using, of the puppies at least. Was he using her too? His heart said yes. Either one was wrong, and he'd done it without thinking. How had he allowed himself to imitate his father's cold, manipulative ways? He stomped up the steps, leaving angry boot prints in his wake. Suddenly, having Linda in the office felt like he was playing into his father's master plan. He gripped the handle of the front office door and slammed it behind him. The pictures on the wall rattled. A fresh wave of guilt washed over him as he took them in. Biddle House, Round Island Lighthouse, the Grand Hotel, Arch Rock, the Menugian House, all blanketed in snow. The thoughtful woman from the loud, cheerful family deserved better than him. The son of a man who only saw people as pieces in a game he had to win by any means necessary. Keys jingled in the unlocked door, and a chill pushed into the room as it swung open. Linda stepped inside, snowflakes covering her shoulders and hat. At her side was a big brown and white dog, a larger version of Cupid. "Look who I found!" The happiness in her voice was like an arrow in his heart. He knew what she was thinking. Another Christmas miracle. "Cupid's mom," he said, his tone flat. Just then, the puppy bounded into the room and sprinted toward the dog at Linda's side. The two sniffed one another's noses, and she nuzzled and licked him from head to toe. "I told you we'd find her. I don't know who's happier, me or Cupid," Linda said. The heartwarming scene made him think of his own mother. A raw surge of pain rippled up from a place in his heart he'd long ago buried, and he again remembered the real reason he wanted to leave this island. It wasn't simply the weather, the small-town aspect, or even the draw of Vanessa Miro somewhere else. It was the fact that this place reminded him of the family he'd lost, the mother he'd lost, and how that loss left him with a cold shell of a man as his father. He wanted to run as far and fast away from all of it as he could. "What should we name her?" Linda asked. "How about Milagros? It's Spanish for miracle." The last thing he wanted was another attachment to Mangle. "She's not a miracle. It's not a very big island. If she was still alive, you were going to find her eventually." He didn't even try to keep the harshness from his tone. Linda took a step back, her brow furrowed in confusion. "Okay, we can name her something else." "I'm not naming her." He crossed his arms over his chest. "I wasn't going to ask you to keep her." "Good, because I'm not," he said, his voice colder than the air outside. He hated taking this tone with her, but it was for her own good. "I don't know if I ever said it, but thank you for taking them in. And I'll keep her," Linda said. "Good, and I've decided to keep Cupid permanently." In his heart, Cupid had been his dog since that first morning when he'd managed to climb through the little barrier. "So we don't need to find any more homes. They're all taken care of." The finality was intentional, and he hoped she could read between the lines. "Is that your way of telling me you don't need me to come in anymore?" Her voice quivered. The sound made him feel worse than he would have if he'd told a kid Santa Claus wasn't real. But he needed her to realize he was fruit from a poisoned tree. He needed her to run. He needed everything he'd ever touched in relation to this practice to disappear, because in that instant, he realized he was leaving. For one brief moment at the ceremony, he'd considered staying, for her. But as long as he lived in the long, dark shadow of his father, he wasn't good for anyone. "You're the one who set the terms of our arrangement," he replied. "It was always going to be temporary until the last dog found a home. Well, Cupid's staying with me, so they've all found their homes." "What's wrong with you, Zach? Why are you acting so cold? I thought you'd be happy I found her." Linda rubbed the dog's flank and she wagged her tail. "Is this because we kissed?" Her words were a dagger to his heart. That kiss had been unlike anything he'd ever experienced. When he said nothing, he watched her face crumple into a mask of pain, twisting the dagger even deeper. He wanted to erase her hurt and thereby ease some of the agony squeezing his own chest. But in the long run, that would only make things worse for both of them. "I guess I misjudged you," she said. "Yeah, I think maybe you did. Whatever you thought there was between us, it was wrong. The kiss. All of it was a mistake." "A mistake? Is that what we're calling it?" "I don't know what you're calling it, but that's what I'm saying." her chin thrust back at the force of his words, her eyes rounded in a shock that he felt too. This was over, and his words needed to make that fact clear for both of them. The door blasted open and a crowd of people rushed into the lobby, led by old Nate, who had a man slung over his shoulder. The expressions on their panic-stricken faces stopped Zach in his tracks. These were true outdoorsmen, some of whom had been to war. Nothing fazed them. "Doc, it's Nick. He fell through the ice off the bay shore. He's unconscious. You've got to help him," old Nate said. Zach's adrenaline surged, pushing his pain over, fighting with Linda to the side so the skilled doctor in him could take center stage. In that instant, nothing mattered but saving a man's life. "Carry him to the exam room," he told the group. The men nodded and raced toward the back office. He caught sight of Nick as old Nate and the others hurried by. Nick didn't look good. His eyes were swollen and his lips and skin were a sickly blue. "What should I do?" Linda asked, her voice focused and calm. He could tell saving Nick was the only thing on her mind, too. He was glad she was there, and that she was the type of woman who would sweep aside her own hurt to focus entirely on another. Amidst all the pandemonium, he couldn't help but admire her. "Have one of the men help you get off his wet clothes and wrap him in the foil blanket while I grab the hemo machine." Once he had the machine, he raced into the exam room. Nick still had a pulse, which was good, but it was weak, and he wasn't going to keep it if they didn't bring up his body temperature. Zach prayed the hemo actually worked. This was the first time he'd laid hands on the contraption since stepping foot in the practice. Linda had Nick wrapped, and she, old Nate, and Frank Griffith were rubbing his extremities. He tried to push away his doubt over Nick's prognosis, but this time of year the Great Lakes were so cold it might as well have been Antarctica. "Concentrate on his feet," Zach said. "I'm going to have to recycle his blood to warm it." "Got it," she said. And again, he was grateful she was there, her steady presence helping him to remain firm and decisive. He found a vein and affixed Nick to the hemo machine, then let out a huge sigh of relief when it grumbled to a start. No one spoke for the next 40 minutes. Everyone seemed to be lost in their own thoughts, perhaps willing Nick to make it through. For Zach's part, he was praying that Nick would be all right. The silence broke when Nick blinked. "Did you see that?" Linda asked, that light of hers shining. "Nick's tough as leather. He'll be okay," old Nate said. Frank grumbled his assent. "Remember that time he was out mowing the lawn and ran over a hornet's nest?" "I remember that." Frank ran his hands over his beard. "I heard him hollering clear on the other side of the island." Old Nate nodded. "There had to have been at least 500 hornets in that nest." "Yep, he's got ox blood in those veins," Linda said, triggering more laughter. "He's stubborn as an old mule, that's for sure," Frank added. Nick let out a long, low moan. His lips twitched several times as though he was struggling to speak. Finally, he opened his eyes, blinked, then closed them again. 1,000, he whispered so faintly, Zach wasn't sure if he'd heard him correctly. Leaning forward, so close the man's breath ghosted his cheek, Zach said, "Did you say something, Nick?" Nick blinked 2 more times, then twisted his lips. "There were 1,000 of them buggers." Old Nate and Frank laughed. Linda did too. "You're back," Zach said, exhaling and checking his stats, which were surprisingly stable. "Did I have a choice? Had to make sure these two got the story right," Nick said. The men laughed again, louder this time, and something of their relieved laughter settled in the room and warmed the walls. "Can you feel your fingers and toes?" Zach asked. Nick wiggled them, then nodded. "Good job," Zach assured him. Frank looked over at old Nate, then at him. "You saved him, Doc. You saved our friend's life." There was something unspoken in the man's expression. A bond had formed between them, linking him to the island even more than his birth here. "Now don't you try to use this as an excuse to get out of going ice fishing with me and the boys," Frank continued. "He just stepped onto a weak pocket, but I know how to spot him." For the first time in an hour, the decision Zach had made this morning came back to him. If he left, ice fishing was off the table. Not that he believed any ice was safe ice, but the fact that he was even considering voluntarily spending time in the cold surprised him. "We'll have to see about that," he finally said, completely lost and uncertain. "Ah, you should go, Doc. You'll love it. But I thought I was a goner when that ice cracked." Nick reached out of the foil blanket. "What about my pup? Is Donner okay?" His voice was weak, but stronger than Zach would have expected. "Donner is the reason you're alive," Frank said. "She started barking and wouldn't stop. Ran to old Nate's ice shanty and he pulled you out." "Where is she now?" "She's at the cabin, getting spoiled by my grandson," old Nate said. Nick smiled. "She's a good girl, my Christmas miracle." "Yes, she is," Linda said, rubbing Nick's hand. Zach's gaze followed her touch, absorbing the caring way she peered at Nick. There was no such thing as miracles, right? Nick fell back to sleep, and the men decided they would let him rest. They said their goodbyes, and Linda gave a slight nod, almost to herself it seemed, as though she'd too made a decision. Watching her walk out that door was the hardest thing Zach had done since he'd laid his mother in the ground. Chapter 16. Fresh Air. Zach. The next day, Zach sat at his office desk, cradling the phone between his shoulder and his ear. There was no such thing as miracles. The only thing that had ever come close in his life was the fact that Linda had almost convinced him they might exist, although the conversation he was having was really making him question his worldview up until this point. "What exactly are you saying, son?" his father asked. That was the first time his father had called him son in as long as Zach could remember. "I'm saying I'm changing the terms of our agreement. I reached out to one of my Morehouse friends, and he's agreed to take my place at the practice till Skip graduates. I'll still repay your money, but I'm going back to Atlanta. I've already lined something up." No. He was a grown man. The days of his father telling him what to do were long gone. "You're free to return and take over the practice yourself," Zach offered. His father let out a pained sigh that was almost as much of a surprise as hearing him use the word son. The senior Albert rarely, if ever, displayed emotion. "Fine." "Fine," Zach muttered, rubbing his jaw. He'd prepped for more of an argument than this. "Look, if it comes down to the practice or my son, I choose my son. I know I haven't done the best job of showing you, but I do want you to be happy. And I thought you'd be happy on the island. It's a unique place, a special place. But I never should have manipulated you into going back to Mackinac. I guess I did it for selfish reasons." The words coming out of his father's mouth were so foreign, Zach didn't know what to say. He'd never heard the man sound like this. His tone was usually clipped and precise, like the scissors he'd use to snip a bandage. And he'd definitely never heard his dad say anything like this. Perhaps this was yet another manipulation. When he remained silent, his father continued, "But you're your own man. You always have been, and I've always been proud of you for it." Wow. Zach shook his head, his throat squeezing tight. Had his father just said what he'd thought he'd said? That he was proud of him? If this was another manipulation, it was a darn good one. "Your mother and I were so happy on that island. I wanted you to know some of that happiness," his father said. "Mom?" His father never mentioned her. Hearing him do so now knotted Zach's chest. He breathed hard. Even he wouldn't have invoked her name to advance an agenda. His dad's words about happiness brought to mind an afternoon a month before she died. They'd all sailed to the lighthouse for the weekend. On the last day, he begged them for one more swim before they went home. They swam from the boat to the shore. There, they'd found rocks and made an arrangement on an old tree stump. The formation had looked like a little family. He'd wanted to take it with them when they'd left, but his father said it was better to throw the rocks back into the water so they'd always be there, a happy memory waiting for them whenever they came back to that place. After she'd died, he'd told his father that he wanted to go back. Instead, his father sold the boat, and Zach hadn't been on one since. He didn't understand until he got old enough to form his own theory about pain. The monster without feet. The lighthouse was where the monster lived for his father. Zach cleared his throat. "Do you remember the rocks?" Silence stretched on the other end of the line. "At the lighthouse?" Zach ran his palm over his curls. "Why didn't you take me there?" His father exhaled. "One day, when you have children of your own, you'll understand that sometimes a father's love is imperfect. There were certain decisions I had to make to give you the stability I thought you needed." The office window overlooked the lake. In the distance, Zach saw the ferry approaching. His mind drifted to his theory of pain. He'd always believed he'd come up with it on his own, but listening to his father, he realized he hadn't. The idea of running from pain had come directly from him. "I'm not sure what to say. I appreciate you telling me all this. I need to think," Zach said. "Take your time. Like I said, I want you to be happy." Zach hung up the phone, grabbed his coat, and put Cupid in his harness. "Come on, little guy. I think it's time for some fresh air." Cupid leapt down the stairs to the sidewalk, and his energy only amplified when they reached the massive lake a few steps away. The puppy barked at the waves and tried to bite them, but Zach wouldn't let him get close to the frigid waters. Something told him the dog wouldn't be kept back come summer. The pup was born to swim. An image of the dog playing in the lake brought a smile to Zach's lips. He'd seen so many other people throw balls, and the glee in their faithful companions as they retrieved them and swam back to shore. Realization hit Zach like the icy spray off the lake, sharp and crisp. If he moved back to Atlanta, he'd probably work such long hours he wouldn't be able to take Cupid out as often. His whole life would revolve around his job. The truth was, he had it pretty good here on this quirky little island, with this town full of people who were fast coming to feel like family. Then there was also Mark and the rest of the kids at the Ark. If he stayed, maybe this summer he could get old Nate to work with him and Mark on another boat. In doing so, he'd also be able to build something solid with which to move into the future, another thread of connection to pull him out of his isolation. He knelt and kneaded his fingers through the hair along Cupid's soft back. Cupid wagged his hips and tail. The dog's relentless joy was a great teacher. There was a lot to celebrate on this island, a lot to fight for, and he had the power to do that without becoming his father. Cupid was proof. Sure, he'd said that he'd taken the dogs for commerce, and part of him had, but part of him had also taken them because Linda had wanted him to, and because he wanted to make her happy. That woman! She'd thanked him for taking the dogs. But really, he should have thanked her for pushing him to take them, for seeing what he couldn't, that there was more to life than running from his past, because in doing so, she'd sparked his desire to protect, to care for, and most importantly, to meet his pain where it was at, and to vanquish it with the greatest medicine of all, love. Dear God, what had he done? Chapter 17. Cupid's First Christmas. Linda. Linda lifted the sauce ladle to her lips, nibbling on a sample of cranberry sauce. "This is ready to go, Eve," she called to her cousin, her voice lacking its full holiday mirth in spite of her best efforts. "You can plate it and put it on the table." The Christensen kitchen was filled with at least a dozen people talking at once. Everyone was excited about the aromas filling the air, sweet and savory alike. Jingle bells blasted from the old boom box on the counter, and in the living room, her father had Miracle on 34th Street playing for the kids. It was a crowd favorite. Everyone else drifted between the family room, the dining room, and the kitchen, nearly 60 people in total. The chaotic scenes that played out in the Christensen home weren't much different from years prior. Her sister Joy had brought her 6-month-old twins. Her brother Joseph was here with his new wife. The group was larger, but these were her people, together for their favorite holiday. Usually, she was so happy this time of year she could have powered up the Christmas lights of the town tree with her inner energy. But this year, she knew when they sat down for dinner there'd be one person she would miss. The same person she'd been missing for the last few days. Zach. Is the macaroni and cheese ready? Joy interrupted Linda's thoughts. Yeah, you can put that out too and call Joseph. Tell him to come get the turkey out of the oven. Get the doorbell, her mother called from across the kitchen. Linda hadn't heard it, but she'd been lost in her thoughts. How had she been so wrong about him? Well, she hadn't exactly been right about her ex either. Maybe at a certain point, her feelings for a guy clouded her perception, and she saw what she wanted to see instead of what was really there. She sighed. If that was the case, she was in for a bleak future. Melinda Noel, someone's here for you, her mother said. For me? She asked, but her mother didn't answer. Linda smiled. Her mom's nose was already buried in the next pot. Linda wiped her hands on her apron. Milagros followed on her heels as she waded through the crowd in the dining room, trying to still her pulse. There was only one person she could think of who would come to her house, ring the bell, and then not follow the noise and join the crowd. Zach, she said, doing a double take when she turned the corner. He was standing there, the green scarf she'd given him, wrapped around his neck and holding Cupid in his arms. Milagros trotted over to her pup, wagging her tail and sniffing. The hint of a smile ghosted the corners of Zach's lips, and he held Cupid closer to the dog. He looked different, lighter and more relaxed, and a Santa Claus hat sat on his head. Her chest squeezed. This is the Zach she'd been hoping to unearth. Had the Russells succeeded where she hadn't? I thought you guys were having Christmas with Cheryl and Leanne, Linda said. I let them know a couple of days ago that I wouldn't be able to go, but I went by and dropped off a gift. We chatted for a while, and I told Cheryl I wanted to come see you, to apologize for the things I said to you the other day. Her brow creased in confusion. You canceled a date for Christmas dinner to come see me. I can't imagine that went over very well. His brow crinkled, then smoothed. He shook his head. A date? Is that what you thought? He ran his hand over his mouth. Wow, there's nothing between her and me. I'm so sorry if I gave you any other impression. I'm so sorry for everything, he blurted. I'm sorry for my tone and my words. He looked at Milagros. I'm sorry for the way I talked to you too, girl. I'm so happy that this amazing woman didn't give up and she found you. He tucked his hand into his front pocket. His gaze fell to the floor, but he lifted it, fixing his eyes on her. More than anything, I'm sorry I pushed you away, Linda. I pushed when what I really wanted to do was pull. Her breath caught at his words, and even though they were nice, they still weren't enough to take away the hurt. I thought I was going to close the practice, he said. She tilted her head to the side in surprise. You did? What about the debt to your father? His eyebrows slanted into a frown. I was going to find another way to repay it. Why? What had she missed? To set out and chart my own course, one independent of the Albert family name or our dysfunctional father-son dynamic. Ah, that was understandable. Her mind went back to that box. She'd never found out what was inside it, but clearly it had upset him considerably. I thought part of the agreement was that you stay for a year. He nodded slowly. I was prepared to have someone else step in for me, but I changed my mind. He pressed his lips together. A lot of things have changed. She nodded and held his gaze. What changed your mind? He pet Cupid's head. A long overdue talk with my father, and a miracle. At last. She smiled and took a step closer to him. He smelled of fresh air and aftershave. I thought you didn't believe in miracles. I didn't. Not until you came along. Turns out I needed an angel to teach me how, and to show me what happiness is. Oh, really? She wanted to forgive him. She really did, but she was scared. You said a lot of hurtful things, Zach. He winced. I know, and I'm so sorry. I know you've been hurt before, and I never wanted to be a man who would do that to you. I don't expect you to forgive me right away. I'm just asking for a chance." He stepped closer to her. Cupid yipped. Her breath caught. "And I'm wondering if that invitation for Christmas dinner is still open." There was a plea in his eyes so deep and soul-stirring that all of her doubts evaporated. Zach wasn't the only one enjoying a Christmas miracle. That deep knowing had returned, the one that gave her a sense of people's truest intentions, the one that had ultimately guided her away from her ex in Miami and back here to the people she loved. When she gazed into his eyes, she knew she was looking at her future, and it glowed with the brightness of a Yule log. "How could I say no to Cupid's first Christmas?" she asked. Don't say no. Say yes to us, to our first Christmas, the first of many." His eyes were full of promises that reached into her heart, and he reached for her. He ran the tips of his fingers down her arm, sending goose flesh rising beneath her sweater. They slid past the side of her hands and laced with hers, replacing the chill with a delicious warmth. "Yes," she said, but the words were lost in a kiss sweeter than Nova's candy cane cocoa. The end. Thank you for reading Cupid's First Christmas by Tana Jenkins. If you enjoyed this sweet, grumpy sunshine romance, you'll also like the rest of the St. James Sisters collection, available in ebook, paperback, and audio through Amazon.